All right. So here at Scaling Laws, we know we have the most AI savvy audience of any podcast, but notwithstanding the impressive sophistication of our listeners, Nathan, let's just make sure everyone's on the same page here. Softball for you. What is an open source AI model and how is it distinct from a closed model?
I wouldn't call this as a softball. I think this is a sometimes contentious question within the actual community that wants to define it. But generally, a directionally open model versus a closed model is one where pieces of it are available for the public to download and run or poke at on their own. And generally, the correct way to think about openness is that it's actually on a gradient from even an API is a potential level of openness because all these companies have models that are not available via API or maybe just via ChatGPT, all the way to when you upload the weights and then the training code and then the data and then the actual logs of what happened when you were trying to train it. So there's a lot of different levels to this, but the fully mostly accepted answer is that an open source model is one that has pretty much everything that one needs to recreate it, including these giant data sets. But there are a lot of discussions ongoing on what actually should be that definition.
Yeah, it seems to me that the people get really tripped up by the history of all of this because, of course, with traditional software, I think it's a lot more straightforward what it means for something to be open, which is that the source code is open, and that's why it's called open source software. And then you get to AI, and the source code is only one part of it. You have the weights, you have the data, you have access to compute, which is its own thing. You have prompts, you have a million things that can be open or closed. And so, it seems to me that a lot of what is called open, open source AI today is not necessarily open. And I'm curious, just to stay with you, Nathan, you're at the Allen Institute, and my sense is that you are all at the forefront of releasing actual open AI systems, and sort of curious how you think about that when Mark Zuckerberg talks a big game about releasing Llama being open, but is it really open? And so just talk about that, if you will.
Yeah, so I think there's obvious commercial incentives to not want to fully open up the stack for these very valuable artifacts and make them even easier to reproduce. We hear about distilling from popular models, but if you just release your training data set, that's going to make it even easier for somebody to just recreate your model. And there's the other side of commercial things is liability. So when companies release their data sets, I think these big public companies are very big targets for lawsuits, which we've seen some of them making progress to the mostly copyright system. And I think the kind of open source definition thing is people like to compare it to open source software, but even that took years to really converge through free software and other early movements. So what I see what we're doing at the Allen Institute is trying to make these resources so that people can come up with the right definitions and way to think about open source AI, because the models are just getting to the point in the open, I think, some of our models, but if you look at a lot of open weight models from across the world, it's getting to the point where people can start to actually use this ecosystem, where in the past, a lot of it was just vibes, where it's we should have this thing because it's good for research over the next 5 to 10 years and stuff like this, which is a very different premise than how Linux evolved and became this kind of foundation of commercial software as well. So we're at different points in the timeline.
And something that Nathan said, but I think it's sort of important to double tap on, is that the issue of copyright is actually, it's not only a thing that's affecting big tech, but here in Europe, for example, academics are also thinking, if we release this open weight model, are we going to be liable for something? Because actually quite a lot of the sort of big open source data sets that researchers have been using historically would contain theoretically something that might fall under some form of copyright protections. I think Common Crawl is one example, and it's really causing issues on the innovation side of things, to be honest, and on the academic research side as well.
Well, so given that I've thrown, I guess, not a softball, but a spike ball, Nathan, you handled it excellently. Keegan, you as well. Why then are we seeing these companies spend millions of dollars to release open models? Or for those who aren't watching the video, I'm using air quotes around open now. Open models like Meta. And presumably, we've seen announcements from OpenAI that they're planning on doing an open model as well. What's the justification there or motivation there? And Keegan, let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few different things that are going on. First and foremost, as we talked about earlier, when it comes to today's digital world, it's been built off the back of open source software pretty much across the entirety of the world, if you're looking at some sort of technological system, you're going to find open source. Even in government and leading businesses, you will find open source software. It's everywhere. When it comes to AI, I think there's sort of a growing understanding that this is going to be, like a general purpose technology is going to be something like the internet. It's going to impact most sort of facets of our economies, societies, and so on. It's really beneficial if that technology is widely distributed and you're the one who built it. So from like a business perspective, it makes sense to sort of release it for free, have folks build on top of it, build in the sort of dependencies. And then there's also the innovation potential as well. We know that open innovation systems work. You have more people looking at it. There's advantages when it comes to safety and security theoretically. A lot of sort of really important like software is related to security, for example, would be open source. If you think about like an Estonian example would be that they open source their electronic voting identity code base like a couple weeks before the election because they want people to come in and look and see that is trustworthy. This is infinitely harder in the open source AI space because of some of the things that we were talking about before. So you're not going to be able to have the same level of sort of confidence that you're able to interrogate these models like you could in open source code base for software. But realistically, it's like, it comes down to making sure that the rest of the world is basically running on your sort of model. And then it also serves the advantage of undercutting your, competitors. If you can give something away for free and they have to keep burning money and people are going to choose your free option over theirs, you sort of get rid of the economic incentive. Mix of things. But I'm sure Nathan has some thoughts on this as well.
I think there's very different dynamics based on localities across the world. So I'm not posited to be a China expert, but there's a lot of emerging research and understanding that China is fostering very intentional kind of collaboration between industry and academia, where this interfaces a lot of their open models. And once some of the companies saw success there, I think there's kind of a regression to the like what is the simplest strategy that works, which is all of these up and coming Chinese companies. I think everybody knows about DeepSeek, and then last week before recording, Kimi, this Moonshot AI company, released a model that's better in performance than DeepSeek. But there are a lot more, whether it's ByteDance or Minimax or 0.1 AI or I think Tencent. It's like I could try to pull as many off the top of my head, but all of these companies are releasing very strong open models across multiple modalities, which is kind of like a norms thing emerging from China. But on the US side, we generally see that open models are adopted very fast and drives costs down. So DeepSeek is hosted on literally like every AI platform in the world, and those things, the costs of the models is going to be driven down way more than a lot of these proprietary API companies, which is it is a very similar open source thing, which is more people can contribute to these kind of inference engines, and these have extremely optimized architectures that might be different than what closed labs are actually converging on. Where previously, I think the dynamic in the US was a lot of vibes, which is like Meta and Mark Zuckerberg, to give him credit, like historically has been very pro open and saying that like, yes, this is American values to like just build the best technology and give it away for the free, and so that most people can build on it and have this American standard, which I agree with. But now the kind of value is being intermingled with business goals, and there's conflict, and we might see that change. So I think that's kind of why like American companies are very good at financializing products and shipping things, and if that's the strength, I think that's in some ways a natural equilibrium for where they are, even if it's ceding some soft power to China in terms of where the R&D ecosystem is going.
So I just want to just stay on this for a second. And I'm going to go back to this question of incentives for these companies to spend tens of millions and maybe billions at some point one day on these open systems. If you're a nonprofit, if you're a research institute, if you're the Allen Institute, I could understand much more straightforwardly why you would do this. It's because you want to do this. Like that's the whole point. And to your point, Keegan, if you're a business, I also understand these kind of indirect incentives. It gets you better PR. Maybe you can attract better researchers. Maybe you can make Sam Altman miserable every month, and that's good for your vibes. But in terms of directly being able to monetize these systems, I guess I'm still not sure how one would do that. Again, maybe if you're Zuckerberg and you're richer than God, it doesn't matter. But even the biggest companies, building this stuff and certainly running it, though maybe with open source you have someone else run it, maybe that's the way you deal with it, but certainly training it is still a lot of money. So is there at the end of the day any way to monetize an open system directly or indirectly?
Lead generation. I think the joke that like Sam Altman has said in some of the like closed door sessions that they've had for talking about the open model is like they don't want to run it on their GPUs, which is kind of like a snarky thing for also incorporating private data. But like I think of that as kind of like it's like the levels of the pipeline, which I think like Mistral and Cohere are kind of like this, where they open source a lot of their mid-tier models, and they have like increasingly like their smallest models are permissive license. They release bigger models with non-commercial license, and then they have private models on their platforms. And I think that a lot of it is that, which is it's so early that they're trying to get market share, and they don't know what the actual final equilibrium will look like. And I mean, if you use AI tools, you will know that the final equilibrium is in flux, and it's like, oh, you shift from a ChatGPT user to Claude Code is probably the most interesting thing right now, and you have all these different subscriptions, and you're happy to just jump ship. I think if you look at that, you kind of have to try a lot of things and see what actually makes people want to use your tools. Whereas maybe like OpenAI gets them by making their chat or their like CLI Claude Code equivalent thing work really well with open models as well. So it's much cheaper for people to start, but then they turn off and they're like, oh, let's get the better one and have OpenAI pay the bills. I don't think people like I think everybody's frenetic and a little bit scared about their lunch getting eaten. So they also need to play this game. Otherwise they might lose out.
I mean, I think one thing that I would just also add as well, right, is that Meta has a massive ecosystem. Its business is in sort of advertising and marketing. So it has WhatsApp, it has Facebook, obviously, it has Instagram. It would benefit by having its users there use its AI systems. It wants to make sure that its AI models are better than its competitors. One of the best ways to do that is actually to open it up to the world and get them to, sort of build on it. And to be honest, Meta has a history of doing quite a lot of this. WhatsApp basically powers, entire societies around the world because of how efficient and effective it is. India comes to mind sort of off the top of my head. This is nothing new for them. Actually, it's kind of a play that they've made many times. I think it's worked. I think one thing that's probably also just worth mentioning is that when Meta came out as an open source sort of proponent, that was not in any way, shape, or form like the dominant or prevailing narrative in DC. That we were still sort of when, in the time of AI is going to end the world, open source is inherently dangerous. We're going to have terrorists making like chemical and biological weapons, and you can't release open source models. I think it's fine to have discussions about these sorts of risks and threats, and there's a role for government to play in that. But models have advanced so much since then, and these concerns have sort of like fallen by the wayside, which I think is important. But what's interesting is that this administration, I think, is taking like a huge sort of shift in how they're thinking about open source compared to the previous one.
Yeah, and let's just hold off on going that full route for a second, because that's a can of worms we can get to. But before we open up yet another can, because I think we've got at least 3 open at this point, I want to circle back on a key question here, which is the capabilities of these open source models to begin with. Going back to narratives, we've heard historically that open models aren't as advanced as these closed models that we're seeing. Nathan, can you give us a sense of how these rank on kind of the key benchmarks that we're seeing, whether it's looking at open source models here in the States, abroad, and just where things stand in terms of the actual capabilities of these different models?
I think we could kind of draw through a few years of history here. I think if you go back to say like 2023 when post ChatGPT bloom was starting, and through almost like DeepSeek realistically, there's been a 6 to 18 month lag between open and closed models, and especially a lot of the top open models had kind of like kind of finicky licenses that meant that they weren't fully easy to use across the board. Maybe Llama 3.1 was kind of a high watermark of this, where That was like the closest to frontier they had been, but it's closely overshadowed by the kind of era that we're in with DeepSeek right now. So kind of in these first like few years, most of it was American open models were mostly leading 6 to 12 to 18 months behind the actual closed frontier from OpenAI and Anthropic. And then this kind of pivoted with this DeepSeek release that anyone listening to this podcast has surely absorbed media on. And that was when like China was clear, the Chinese models were clearly ahead. They were even closer to the frontier of performance. So like DeepSeek R1 was only a few months after this O1 release, which was this kind of paradigm shift. So there's this kind of immediate flip-flop between closer gap to the peak of performance, the kind of flop from US to China, and then we've been at this now, and like DeepSeek had updated their models, and Kimi K2 has come out, where now like this Kimi model is comparable to things like Claude 4 Sonnet. I think the benchmarks are starting to be less of the story as people in the industry are shifting from standalone models and chat to other interfaces where a lot more behaviors that aren't captured in these like frontier math and very hard coding benchmarks that are designed for this kind of like one model doing it in a chat window. It's no longer as easy to compare. So I think like these Chinese models are showing that they can really climb on the benchmarks, but I do think that the spotlight of closed models in the US is shifting more towards deep research, Claude Code, OpenAI Codex, and all these things where there's a huge gap there, and in the open weight models, it hasn't been shown to actually do that. So it's easy to spin the story of like open is as close as it has been, but I think there's kind of different gaps emerging. So it's kind of both are true.
So just to clarify something you said, Nathan, when we talk about how open models tend to be, some number of weeks or some number of months behind closed models, that's not necessarily a difference in sort of like how they are made or how they are designed or how they are trained. It's just a statement about the relative talent and resources of the closed labs like OpenAI and Anthropic and Google relative to the open labs like Meta and DeepSeek.
It's mostly a comment on the like accumulation of progress. So when you're building language models, a lot of it ends up being stacking bricks brick by brick and small data improvements, small algorithmic improvements, small integration with your infrastructure improvements. And like it just happens to be where the different players are at. So when you look at DeepSeek and Kimi catching up so much, like that is a gain that they have had. And it's like they have like similar talent. They have less infrastructure than the US things, and they're accumulating rapidly like research know-how. So like that is stuff that is definitely there, and the artifacts are kind of a capture in time.
Well, and to double down on that, Keegan, can you walk us through why it might be presumably easier to build open source models in China? I mean, we saw recently the New York Times op-ed that went round the world, Kyle Chan's piece warning us all that China was ready to leap years ahead of the States, kind of highlighting the fact that they're investing in their full tech stack, whether it's data, whether it's compute, whether it's data centers. How is that influencing their kind of ability to release these open models at a faster clip and at higher degrees of capability?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few different things going on. Probably first and foremost, China wants to be the world-leading technological superpower. I mean, that's clear, and it's basically betting everything that it has to make that reality. That's not just in AI; that's also in robotics. It's in now more on semiconductor manufacturing. It's on quantum. It's on bioinformatics. Like any sort of technological revolution is going to matter in the next 10 to 20 years. You can pretty much guarantee that China is throwing everything it has at it. When it comes to AI, I think there are a number of inbuilt advantages that China has over the United States, to be honest. If you look at trust in artificial intelligence in the United States, in the West, it's actually pretty low. Maybe 20, 30, 40% people are like happy and excited by it. If you look at the same number in China, closer to 90%. If you look at the amount of technology that people interact with on a daily basis in China, everything's going to be more or less run through a single app. You have technology like ingrained within the society. And that has a number of advantages. For example, you have a lot of people that live in China, which means you're generating a lot of data. And the more you're interacting with digital systems, that means you're generating even more data. And then you have a sort of ruling and governance regime that's very happy to put rules and processes in place that basically say, we need to take these resources that we have, pull them together and use them for the sort of like national good, or in this case, accelerating Chinese leadership in international AI governance, AI leadership. And as a result, they're doing things like investing in sort of new data modernization, interoperability, being able to move data between place A and place B, optimize it for sort of training of AI systems, allocating compute support to those who need it the most. It's and there's the like internal competitive dynamics as well. I think China is actually ruthless in terms of how it competes domestically in ways that I think most folks in the West don't necessarily understand. So when everybody else is doing open source, you have to as well. People here talk about DeepSeek primarily, but to be honest, like Quen, for example, was already quite good in making waves in the ecosystem, and I don't see this going away anytime soon. If anything, they're just going to keep pushing down because there's no reason not to. They have everything to win and not much to lose. They're getting the world to run on Chinese open source models. While we talked a little bit about performance, to be honest, most people are happy to use things that are cheaper but work good enough, which is what we could probably put the open source AIs coming out of China as. But to be honest, it's also quite good. It's serious, and it's something that the U.S. and its allies really need to be thinking about.
So we're going to get to this question of what do we do, especially given China's advances, and we'll obviously talk, Nathan, about your sort of proposal for an American DeepSeek. But before we do that, I still want to finish up a little bit of the table setting by taking a moment to talk about sort of what the benefits and costs are of having a proliferation of advanced open systems. And Keegan, let me actually start with you. A big concern, or at least we've sort of talked around this a little bit in this conversation, but a big concern, at least in the past, around open systems would be that you proliferate these very capable models. You can't control how they're used. You can't control how they're modified, and that can create all sorts of security risks and national security issues. How has that prediction borne out? And also, not just in and of itself, but also relative to the kind of benefit that has often been used to justify open AI models, which is not just that democratizes access, but it can also advance the state of the art, which of course is kind of two sides of the same coin, right? You can think that advancing the state of the art is both a good thing if you think it is, and then also a bad thing if it's uncontrolled. So there's just a complicated cost-benefit discussion we've had for a few years, and I'd love to hear, I think starting with you, Keegan, then we'll go to Nathan, how you feel like that debate has kind of cashed out in the last 6 months or so.
To be honest, I mean, I think there were a lot of concerns. I think it's right that, we have people in government who are thinking about these things, and there's obviously a role for institutions like the now CASUS, the Center for Artificial Intelligence Standards and Innovation, to like play a role in that process and look at what these risks might be and come up with sort of benchmarks and evaluations that labs can use to think through some of that stuff. I mean, in my own research, let's take one example. Elections. We had the super election year. We were more or less told that we were going to see the end of democracy. There was going to be widespread proliferation of misinformation from AI-based systems, and it didn't happen. So my colleagues and I, we wrote a piece for MIT Technology Review that basically looked at that. And I think you see the same thing sort of happen in a bunch of different risk cases, whether that's sort of biological threats, cybersecurity. I think it's clear that there's emerging sort of cyber threats coming because of AI, but that most of the time these arguments ignore the sort of defending benefit that we get from this as well. So the risks, I mean, yeah, they exist. I'm happy to sort of debate these things through with people, but I haven't seen anything that makes me like scared to sleep at night. And on the benefit side of things, the fact of the matter is there are a number of countries and hundreds of millions, if not billions of people who are able to use AI now that wouldn't have been able to if we didn't have open source. And the economic impact, the education impact, the quality of life impact, it's already, showing itself, and it's only going to grow, in my opinion. I think the conversation shifts depending on how capable these systems get. I don't want to go down the sort of like AGI route or anything like that. But certainly, at some point we have to have a conversation about the different trade-offs.
Yeah, go ahead, Nathan.
I mean, I think you mostly covered it. I could take it to kind of a more extreme and blunt angle, which is that we kind of had a nice equilibrium for a while that open models were a bit behind the frontier, and we have time to see like, oh, is there any emerging risks? Most of the emerging risks haven't really played out, as Keegan summarized, and now we're at the point where it's like we're letting this was mostly within the U.S. and allies controlling this, and now it's at the point where there's going to be open models whether or not we do anything about it. So it's like the argument kind of flips from like, should we release open frontier models to, okay, do you want to try to control where these models are and have like economic players that will be accountable to certain things, and rather than just have the models dropped from international players, starting with China, and I'm sure there will eventually be more sovereign AI efforts from wealthy nations. And it's like, do we want people to be defaulting to things that have some level of accountability and discourse rather than things that are coming from abroad? Because I think that, I mean, the other question is, do you want that, or do you want to become another firewall internet state? So I think that that is something that most people, even if it's kind of sour to accept, is something that people should want, which is that we should foster this internally. I'm very sympathetic to stress over the frontier of open models becoming closer to closed, which is, I think we just need to invest in more people involved in kind of monitoring and have different types of researchers using that. So that's at the frontier, but also just at the low level is like the R&D ecosystem. So it's kind of very different models that these DeepSeeks and Kimmies of the world versus what researchers actually use. And currently China has kind of captured both of those. And I think it's much easier. There's kind of two arguments, which is like, you want things that people are using in products to be auditable, but also you want to make sure you're investing in this kind of AI research ecosystem and have it be built on like the full stack of technology that you understand. So I think there's like very clear things that people should want, and it's kind of a one-way door that we should defend we need to like defend the values and create the thing that we want to see, even if there's obvious risk, but the risk thankfully has not really emerged as
Yeah, and something
real
that
yet.
stands out to me that's really fascinating, building on both your points, is a lot of the most positive AI use cases, the sorts of AI use cases where you'll say, okay, that is objectively improving quality of life or it's lowering the cost of living for folks, is often being built with open source. So I went to Meta's Open Source for Scientific Discovery Summit and met folks at the UT Houston Health System, for example, that are building on Llama. I met startups that are improving endoscopic cameras for your colonoscopy, building on Llama. And the World Resource Institute is using Llama to help with deforestation research. There's a reason you don't hear about them building with OpenAI or building with Gemini, right? Because it's just way less costly to use open source. And so if you want to see the proliferation of some of those more positive or objectively positive uses of AI, open source has a pretty good argument to be made there. Well, this is also teeing up a conversation, Nathan, on how we can make these sorts of open source models more available in the US. And you've announced a pretty interesting approach, calling it the American DeepSeek effort, right? Outlined in your interconnected Substack. And what does that mean? Why is it important for us to think about building an American DeepSeek? And what does your proposal actually call for?
Yeah, so I hinted at the different types of models that you can try to build in the previous thing. And I obviously think the American DeepSeek name is a bit contrived, but it's just that people associate DeepSeek with open model if they're sort of following AI. But I'm mostly pointing at it's very cheap to relative to what these companies in the US is spending to develop models that are kind of not necessarily like we want to get to the current frontier, but doing every year, like if you do it a year later, there's so many trickle down gains that it's really not that expensive to do. So it's mostly encouraging more discourse at the intersection of government and private tech to make this money appear for certain entities that can actually train these models, because there are a lot of untapped scientists like in academia broadly, and then there's a lot of people that are trying to do this that just don't have enough compute to do it. So it's kind of encouraging much more urgent multi-party discussions on, look, this money exists. I mean, there's plenty of billionaires that probably also could give it, and it's it's like much less than these tech companies are spending, and it's to help them invest in their 5 to 10 year future of, I don't know, like Nvidia. They want the American research community and their allies to be building on models that are designed for their hardware. Like in 5 to 10 years, that'll be worth a lot if Quen switches to Huawei and these things. I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but it's an easy hedge against that for a lot of companies that have the money to see, like, fund an independent entity that will just make what is just continuing these kind of Quen and DeepSeek playbooks with fully open data and code. I think that's the difference, is that everything is open so that the long tail of researchers in the West kind of colloquially can do research on these models when all this kind of academic compute is starting to come online over the next few years. The number I say is like order of a couple $100 million. I should put this in there when tech companies are spending billions to make single AI models. And all of that is because of targeting a slightly smaller size and using this kind of time advantage of the research catching up and the hardware getting better, where things like GPT-4 were trained years ago. It just costs way more to achieve that performance on older chips and older research knowledge. So that's one way to show the pace of progress. But it's important to qualify that as why the numbers are so different than what you're hearing from big tech. And a lot of the big tech spend is also for inference rather than just getting the models done. So it's kind of a mouthful, but it's the TLDR is that it's actually not that expensive to train these models. It's just more expensive than academic institutions can do on their own. So we kind of need to do that political work to make it so the money that exists can flow for a few years. It's not a permanent thing either.
I think Nathan just mentioned inference there, and I think it's just one thing to highlight as well, which is there's one thing to have the open source model. It's another thing to actually take this and bring it to the world and get them to start using it. And it's pretty difficult to demonstrate this sort of value. So I think it'll be great and it'll be important to have sort of like more open source American AI models, but having the models on themselves doesn't mean anything if you can't get other people to use them. And as long, yeah. But
there is a lot of academic compute coming online. So I think I'm definitely fairly confident in the NSF and other like academic institutions, whether it's the wealthy ones, Harvard, Princeton, whatever. Like a lot of these universities do have moderately sized compute clusters, whether it's a few hundred H100s, and the NSF will definitely make things available where researchers can get small slices. The biggest problem is that these numbers, well, if you look at them, it's like Harvard has 50 million, all these universities have 10 to 20 million. NSF gives 1 to 200 million for all NSF funded AI projects to take a slice of. The problem is that all of these things you can't merge them into a single unit training good models. I think the path for people doing AI research and getting inference on smaller models for research is really ongoing and something that I'm actually less worried about. The problem is that if they have these resources and they're just working on Llama 2 chat because for whatever reason, and it's just the frontier of research will have totally gone to a different field of agents and really long context reasoning models where all of research is done on things that are largely outdated. So that's why I think of the model artifact as kind of something that plugs into that ecosystem that I see this coming. I talk to a lot of people and there's a lot of things I can't say, but I think that is something that all the universities and people are trying to do. But if they don't have the models to make an open academic paper agent that actually works, I think that it just never gets off the ground. Or they use training models.
In terms of funding, I'm curious. Obviously, we're living right now through the evisceration of the federal science funding apparatus. But obviously, even before the Trump administration, I don't think anyone would have said that American public science funding is in its perfected form. So I'm curious how you two, when you think about support that, let's say, the government can provide, whether it's just financial support, whether it's providing like AI ready data sets, whether it's building its own compute infrastructure, spend $100 million on a compute cluster at a national lab and let people use it and things of that nature.
Well, there are some that exist. Like Frontier is divvying out millions of GPU hours to researchers, and it's like I think it's a DOE computer. Like I'm collaborating with people that have used this, or like there are things that are coming online, and
Sure.
I think we need to scale them up.
No, that's great. And I'm just curious whether you think that the government is in a good position to do this, or whether you'd rather the money come from foundations or other sources, or whether it's more money is more better. Like more money is more better.
I think it's more is better usually. I think where it looks like it is going is that the like the national research cuts are mostly trying to not touch AI. Like obviously, I think that's bad. I mean, you said I agree that there are problems with funding. In general, would be nice if funding was more efficient and got to more young people who are trying to prove it, and not like these kind of big. Mini fiefdoms of senior professors that know how to write good grants. I think there's obviously challenges there, but it seems like AI is going to be not touched as much, but I would also expect more philanthropic action and stuff. I just think there's a lot of interest in mobilizing this, and I expect it to come from multiple forms. I think doing it from the government is important because it helps with a different type of what is usually more impartial and kind of longer tail where I'm not not a fundraising expert, but I would guess that philanthropy will have a harder time. There's just a different distribution to cover, and we want to cover as much area as possible and make science possible. So it's like I'm not. I think my views are very boring, so I don't need to keep rambling about it.
I think
Keegan,
from
any spicy views here?
not spicy, but I don't know. Let's see. I think that if we get to the point where we're dependent on government funding to support a single open source model, we have really messed up as a country.
We're
If
at
you look
that
at what's
point.
if you look at what's happening in China, they have a vibrant ecosystem with competitors who are throwing everything that they have at open source models, and the amount of innovation that's happening there is insane. And we can't let the sort of like dynamism and innovation inside the U.S. Essentially fail. I think it's to be honest, it's quite disappointing to see that we haven't had such an open source AI ecosystem take off in the U.S. I think it's a huge disadvantage. There's a number of risks that are associated as a result of that. We don't have to go into them now, but happy to talk about it later. But what that will require the government to do is make it clear how it will support open source models, for example, going to the rest of the world, creating economic incentives that, as we kind of talked about earlier, might not necessarily be there. But really, if we end up in the point where it's like we're dependent on the NSF to fund a single sort of LLM for open source, and that's all we got, we've already lost the race. That's more of a death rattle than a sort of great sign of innovation, in my opinion.
To just complete the picture here, not only looking at the States, not only looking at China, are we seeing models that we could be following here in the States occur in the UK or in the EU that you think are worth discussing? Or is there just a dearth of funding there?
That laugh did not seem encouraging.
No, the EU,
We'll
the
just end
EU
there.
stop.
Strong
No,
guffaw from
look,
Keegan.
in Europe, you have Mistral. It's not clear how long they're going to continue to be relevant for, and I think their usage is actually rather low. I mean, a lot of what this comes back to is compute. I mean, to put it into sort of perspective, if you look, there's some recent research that found that 75% of the world's sort of HPC, high performance computing, is based in the U.S. 15% is based in China. The last 10% is globally distributed. Of that 10%, I think there's about less than 2% in the UK. I can't, I mean, there's DeepMind there, obviously, but it was bought by an American company. I can't think of a single competitive, widely used open source AI model based out of the UK, even though it does have, quite a lot of AI talent and a pretty robust AI ecosystem. But NVIDIA CEO Jensen basically said a couple of weeks ago that it was the sort of world's largest AI economy without its own infrastructure. And even in like Dubai, Saudi Arabia, but in Dubai in particular, where they were pushing Falcon quite hard, I think they're starting to scale back their model ambitions because the cost to train at the frontier is getting quite high. I know Nathan has the sort of smaller number, but this is the logic that you hear. And at some point, the investment required to create new sort of frontier training data centers is reaching a ceiling. Just like people don't want to invest in some of these data centers because they're not sure, for example, like how long there's going to be demand for the sort of training. It's hard to find folks to underwrite it. At least this is what I'm hearing here in the UK. I don't see that dynamic shifting. I mean, the way that I see it is realistically, we're heading towards a world where you have a handful of countries, probably no more than 5, who can sort of provide the necessary resources, energy, financial capital, compute to train like at the frontier, as the frontier continues to develop. That's not to say there won't be other competitors but if you look at the rate of progress and how fast the capabilities of these models are growing, the dynamics and the sort of actual resources that are available on this planet start to hit, their limits.
I don't think
And
we're
I think
actually
that's going to
there
be
yet.
hard to overcome.
I disagree with a lot of these things. I think that a lot of these countries are actually just co-affiliated with things. So most of it, London's like UK's talent is through DeepMind, which is sucked into this Gemini thing, and probably some people also on Google's open models with Gemma. And then the like Middle East stuff, I think Saudi Arabia is like fairly invested in. Like, they have a new open language model institute that has offices in the Bay Area, and it was previously with like LLM 360, which was one of the prominent open source models out there. And then there's also stuff in the EU in addition to Mistral where they're definitely trying to do this. I know there's some Swiss supercomputer project that put in enough flops into a model to train it. And like the question is whether or not it's good. I think there are a lot of people still trying to train models. The DOE also trains models, and I think like their Argonne supercomputer, and they're putting in flops where it would be a similar amount of compute that Meta's training on like their 70B models and stuff. But a lot of people just you don't have the talent density to actually make the model good. So there are way more people with the compute and then still struggling to figure out with the talent, which is why I think that some of these long tail things like Saudi Arabia will take longer, where China has so much talent and maybe not quite as much compute that they're catching up on this model capability side really fast. So you have to look at kind of both the compute and the talent thing, and some of the long tail ones where there's the UK are kind of blurry and absorbed into Google and other institutions.
I mean, just to put it in perspective, like it's actually fitting because the UK has its sort of new compute roadmap launching 52 minutes ago. It dropped. And in that, they expect the compute required for the country will be about 6 gigawatts by 2030. The current amount of compute is less than 2 gigawatts. And just for the listeners, 2 gigawatts is like the size of some of the individual data centers that Meta is currently proposing to build. So one company is like outspending on one data center what entire, theoretically the third largest AI ecosystem in, in the world basically is doing. Like the actual scale of investment that's happening is quite insane, to be honest.
Yeah, go read semi-analysis if you want the actual numbers.
Well, I think that's a good place to end it. Obviously, we'll keep talking about open AI systems, but until then, Keegan and Nathan, thanks for coming on Scaling Laws.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.